Hey everyone, my name is Alex Chow, and I am the creator and artist for Wolf Teaches How to Draw. Welcome to the first of many videos detailing my process for everything in this book, starting with Chapter 1. A big part of this project is to be as transparent as possible. As this is a book about learning how to draw, it's only fair that I show how I do things, and perhaps somebody watching can take a bit more out of it. With AI art being a thing at the time of creating this graphic novel, I also figured that showing my processes will prove all the concepts I teach can be applied to my work and for you as well. I will be giving brief comments on each piece of artwork, and there is a lot to show. If you find it unnecessary, feel free to mute and enjoy the video without the sound of my voice. Rest assured, I won't take any offense. Thank you for supporting my work. It's been a pleasure creating this graphic novel, and I hope you enjoy these videos. Even though I'm showing this spread to you starting out, this establishing shot was actually created after every single other page was completed in Chapter 1. This was largely due to our publishing editor requesting a establishing shot in the chapter, whereas before it abruptly started with Lila finding the video game console in the landfill. I guess it's fair to really start off by saying that it's very important to always get other eyes checking your work and critiquing it. Otherwise, you can make a habit of judging your own work, which is great and all, but you can get too used to your decisions, good and bad. Everything you see in Wolf Teaches How to Draw has been scrutinized by a lot of people, but also I was very happy to hear that they were critiquing with the intent of keeping it true to my vision. So that is something to think about whenever you are doing any kind of professional work. Now, going into a brief comment on the actual technical side of things with this page, the major thing to watch out for here is the fact that I actually went back and started to simplify some of the masses I put onto the paintings. Generally, a bad habit of mine when I'm doing environment shots is that because elements on a far long shot can be very small, I can start to add too many details, too many little paint brush strokes here and there, and it starts getting a little bit too complicated. You'll find myself zooming out quite a bit, and you'll see it every page that I create. Being able to zoom out is a good way to reset your eyes and judge your work by the grander scale, which is great when you're trying to simplify some of the masses because it allows me to see which masses are important to keep and which ones aren't. So I work with several monitors and I will have many windows of various sizes of this artwork. In instances where I'm zoomed in on my main window and drawing, it allows me to double check on the other windows where it's zoomed out to make sure that the overall composition still works. For environment shots like these, it is by far the most important aspect to be able to get the composition just how you like it. Now, I'm very biased towards my own style, but my mentality about it is that as long as your grander picture works, people tend to be more forgiving on the lack of details and such. It's the hallmark of the impressionistic style, which is what I do for my work. Oh, and in case you're wondering, yes, this is an homage to Ghost in the Shell. The visual when the airplane flies over apartment buildings is actually taken from Hong Kong. One of their airports in the past was very low elevation, which often resulted in the airplanes being dangerously close to the ground level for everyone to see. It was a crazier time back then. Judging by how Lila looks here, you can imagine that this was appropriately one of the first pages I've ever done for this graphic novel. I contemplated several options when it came to the first page I could do for this story. Perhaps it could have been a city shot or maybe something more exciting. But for me, I just felt like this was pretty funny. My intention was to make it seem like Lila finding this video game handheld a big deal, and perhaps hook people to think about why that is and make them continue reading about it. In terms of designing the page, even in the earlier parts of the process here, you'll notice that I played around with white borders. Because this is one of the first few pages I painted, whatever I do here will have to be consistent for the rest of the graphic novel. So after testing a few things, I realized my work just looks better in general with a black border instead. The reason was quite simple. The colors I tend to use would probably feel weaker with a white border because white is essentially the presence of every hue together. Whereas black is good to contrast with all the colored elements in my pages, as black is the absence of color. And regardless of whether you know the scientific reasons of color relativity, sometimes you just have to go with your gut intuition when it comes to this sort of thing, and I did so here. As a final note, you'll notice that my sketches are really, really rough. This is a fairly consistent theme throughout how I draw, and it will be very jarring for people who might use cleaner line art before going to painting. I'll probably repeat this point every so often, but the reason being I like to have very loose sketches so that I'm not confined to the line art. And with my style, I am generally very, very loose with how I paint. So if I am painting within parameters that can't change, then it becomes an issue for me. For the rest of the process videos, keep in mind that thought and check out how I draw. It's basically indecipherable, which makes me a hypocrite because this chapter's lesson is about thumbnails, but I realize I am the culprit for the worst thumbnails of all time. This particular shot started as an isolated illustration. I thought this composition would look really cool because the whole idea of Sophia having a robot gets ham fisted in chapter 2. And I started this illustration slightly after I finished chapter 2, and it just felt pretty wrong that you never really get to see it beforehand. Like I said, the initial intention was to just have a isolated illustration for promotional purposes, like for a wallpaper or print, but it ended up being so solid that I decided to incorporate it in chapter 1 for the reasons I just outlined previously. Before these pages were established, the chapter actually continues several pages from now, which felt a bit wrong because there was no real establishing scene. One of the things that you might have heard of before is the idea of an establishing shot, which is normally what you think of as environmental shots to display what the location is and that sort of thing. But for me, I'm not much of an environment artist, and I'm also not the biggest fan of the traditional idea of an establishing shot. It just feels kind of boring, and sometimes you don't really need to know the exact look of the location. The imagination can pretty much fill it in for viewers. So even though I did plan to have an environment, a longer shot in this, in panel 2, I ended up just having a close up of her face just because it looked cooler. And it was more fitting for the flow of the story that I wanted. Like I said, do we really need to see everything? Do I really need to show the teacher and the lecture hall that she's in? That sort of thing. Maybe that's just my own opinion. One particular thing to note when it comes to the composition and colors here, I tried many schemes as you would imagine through the process of the panel 1 here, but I settled for a very reddish, warm palette, mainly to link with the yellows that are soon to come, and also the warmth serves as a contrast to the blues later on in the chapter. This is mainly to establish the difference in locations as well as the mood. I know a lot of times in schools with fluorescent lighting, it's generally the opposite of this, where it's very cool environment, very green, very blue. But given that it's the start of a story, I didn't really want to make the audience go through a very bluish palette early on. The reds and warmth sort of welcomes the people into the story before I get into the other stuff. One of the main considerations of my style is knowing what to omit from the compositions. And I find it particularly hard when it comes to crowd shots and environments. And this page has both of them. Basically, how much can I put in so that people can still recognize what's going on, but without adding too many details? I often have to ask myself that question because if I don't, I risk putting so many details that it starts looking completely off from the rest of the story. Now, of course, it's likely that I will have inconsistencies anyways, especially when it comes to the character models. But still, I try my best when it comes to the visual aesthetics part that it at least looks a little bit consistent, even if the proportions shift here and there. So you'll see me blurring the piece several times for each panel just to reset things when I find myself putting too many sharp details into it. It's a good cheap way of doing it on digital painting because it emulates human vision. When you're focusing on something, then everything else tends to be blurrier. So my style, I tend to create that effect, even if I have to do it by the cheap way by using the blur feature. And from there, I will start adding little bits of details here and there, impressionistic brushstrokes, until I get what I want. As a final note, it also is problematic when I have to put text into it, in particular with panel 3 here, where I have to show that, yes, the suite number is there. This is for story reasons, just so that I can show that it's a dorm, a college dorm. So even when I'm putting the hard font onto it, I do want to paint over it just so that it creates a more natural effect rather than looking very computerized, which it is, but again, my style I try to give that impressionistic, very loose, traditional look to it, and a lot of things can contradict when I'm creating these story moments. This particular page was difficult because for some reason I wasn't really good at balancing a composition with yellows. If you see the early parts of this, I really tried to use reds and oranges because they're colors that I'm more comfortable with, but it just didn't seem right for a page of two students in a college dorm. I ultimately saved the reds and oranges for other pages throughout Volume 1, and that felt like the right choice in the end. Other than that, I also cut out a lot of the footage where I tried my best to arrange all the text. This is quite a wordy page, even for my standards, but it's also one of the first few pages that readers will ever read. So it was important to establish a lot of things moving forward with these characters. My rule of thumb here is to establish as much as possible without having to force myself to make more pages. Because if I don't say it now, then it'll have to be told later, and that is not very efficient. One small thing, if you really pay attention here, is that I initially named the city Sanctuary City, but I ultimately refrained from doing that because there are real life connotations when it comes to what a sanctuary city is, especially in America, so I opted to just avoid that problem altogether. As this was one of the earlier pages to this graphic novel, the proportions are going to be different from what you see in the later pages. Keep in mind that this was around the time when I was still trying to establish the designs and how things should look. So things weren't really set in stone. I just went with whatever looked good for the page at hand. In particular, the hairstyle of Lila will shift quite a bit throughout Volume 1. Not that I'm happy about it, but it's also one of those things where I'm not going to hit my head over it. I accepted that the way I draw will be fairly inconsistent at times, but I am doing my best to stay on model. If you're ever wondering if this was done in AI, if these process videos are not convincing enough, then the fact that the characters will look different from panel to panel will probably be convincing enough. Other than that, I'm particularly careful about the skin tone when I am dealing with a yellow palette here. It's quite easy to get carried away and put too much warmth into the skin, which will look a bit awkward. Whereas a more muted skin tone, in contrast with the yellow, is good enough to denote that, yes, that is skin. This goes into color theory, which is something I want to avoid speaking about too much as we can go forever on it. It's opening a can of worms. This was unironically one of my favorite pages to paint in Volume 1. Mostly because I felt like all of the shots here were matching quite nicely. And for storytelling reasons as well, I really liked this page to give off Lila's character, as well as what she deals with in order to make money. It took me a while to think about how I could portray that without giving too long of a sob story. And quite honestly, with the fact that I am painting most of these pages, I would like to save as much work as possible. And it just so happened that this one page pretty much told the entire story of Lila's struggle within the underground, the impoverished area of Bastion City. Anything that gives off a grander world in a very efficient manner is very good for storytelling. And I was quite happy I didn't have to go through many pages to describe something that has been told with one page here. I don't treat myself as a master of storytelling by any means. I'm not really capable of writing, the new Game of Thrones, but I'm more than happy to take a few small victories like with this page, which I'm quite happy about. The hardest panel to paint for this one is the first panel here. The reason being is that some of the hardest paintings to make interesting are the ones that seems the most mundane. In this case, having to figure out how to make a hand giving a spray can interesting was not an easy task. If it's too straight on, then it's just completely boring. So I opted to treat it sort of like the traditional Hollywood over the shoulder shot, where one person is clearly off screen and way bigger on the composition, to contrast with the other character who is in the mid-ground or background. Having a variety of scale is very fundamental to a good composition. As for the rest of it, I actually borrowed a painting of a door that I did years ago for another project, and it felt pretty appropriate in panel 3 here. If you're wondering, the door and the city in general is heavily inspired by Hong Kong, which was where I grew up in for my early years of my life. Of course, there's other influences like Tokyo and, in general, just metropolitan cities, but if you're just wondering what my primary references are, there you go. If you've seen my other stuff, you'll probably notice a pattern, and it's that I like to use certain types of lighting. In this particular environment, I'm using a top lighting with a few god rays here and there. There's no particular reason that I like to use this sort of lighting, it just has the mood that I like in my own work. Of course, I really want to sell the ominous environment, so this type of lighting is fairly appropriate. For the design of the environment specifically, I referenced two main places. First, I was looking into the videos of tunnels under Las Vegas. Now, obviously, I'm not taking one to one from reality, but I did want to capture the dark concrete world underneath the city. The second type of environment that might not be as obvious is a forest at night. Now, obviously, I'm not drawing trees here, but in terms of the mood and the verticality of the elements in the piece, a forest actually captures that quite well. If you've ever watched Studio Ghibli's Princess Mononoke, the way they drew the forests were very inspirational. And of course, since I don't really have an excuse to draw forests, I can at least bring out the mood of them and capture the essence of them in my city in certain areas. Keep that in mind whenever you're painting, that you don't always have to reference the most literal examples of what you're drawing. You want to also find references that captures your emotions that you want to portray, which is arguably more important and harder to do. This page is a good place to discuss a interesting challenge that you might face, especially when you're dealing with comic book pages. How do you deal with having two very contrasting color palettes within the same page? It might be easy to think about comic book panels as an isolated illustration, and in there is some truth to it. However, generally speaking, your page has to work as a whole. And I was very careful about how the middle panels looked in contrast with the blues in the Lila panels. Because the first and the last panels are complementary colors to the middle panels, they will contrast each other and accentuate the saturations of both relative to each other. Now, color theory is something I don't want to tap into currently, but the most that you really have to think about is that you don't want to judge the colors by themselves. Make sure that you're scanning the entire page so that it works. If it helps, one of the best ways I like to do this is by zooming out on the painting. You might see me doing this a lot in every single piece of artwork that I do. Zooming out will basically erase all the details and give you sort of like a very muddled thumbnail that you could judge your artwork with. It's sort of like blurring your eyes, and whenever you do that, by taking away all the fluff and the details, that's when you could judge the bigger picture of the piece. And in this case, I utilized to full extent to ensure that the color contrasts work and that it's not too contrasting, or if it's not enough contrast. Looking back at this page, I felt like I didn't actually portray what I wanted. So my intention was for Lila to create something that's really ugly, as if she's a very incompetent artist. But from the looks of it, the graffiti actually didn't turn out too bad here, and I really should have made it look a lot worse. The point of the entire graphic novel is that Lila is coming from a very low level of artistic skill, and this was to portray that, but unfortunately, I don't think I portrayed that properly. But that's something in the past. Other than that, I was very careful about the colors I picked for the graffiti because it will also have to be used for the later fight sequence where she conjures up the painted wolves. So, like, you'll see a lot of cases I would use the warm colors on a very blue tinted artwork. And that's a very classic combo that you would probably have seen in Disney films or otherwise. This two-page spread is actually one of the first paintings I did to create a sort of a proof of concept for Wolf Teaches How to Draw. As such, you'll notice that there will be a lot of weird experimentation with this, especially when it comes to Lila's design. Even at the beginning of this painting, you'll notice that it starts off very warm because I didn't actually know what the environment here would look like. And every other page references this one when I eventually did the other pages for this sequence. A key note in terms of the look of it is the lighting, and I wanted to make sure that I create a very heroic, epic lighting because it's the first time we ever see Wolf. So, in essence, this is probably one of the most important 2 pages that I've made for the story. The only other thing that I wanted to mention is that this is clearly an homage to a video game that's kind of old now. It's called Okami, which of course also involves a drawing wolf. I wasn't really hiding it here. I'm sure the people who know about that video game would probably have noticed that. And I did consider keeping Wolf's look here throughout the entire story, but of course it's going to be read like a ripoff of Okami, so I decided to go against that and go with the look that Wolf has for the rest of the story. Like the previous pages, this was one of the earliest pages for Wolf Teaches How to Draw. But now that I established what the wolf looks like, it was a matter of creating what the monster would look like as well, which was entirely new here. I've tampered with the idea of making really realistic creatures and such, but it really wasn't fitting the style that I was going for. So I opted for a very simple way of drawing shadow monsters, and it sort of worked because it gave a very children's drawing type of feeling, which is sort of my intention. They're meant to be throwaway monsters that are clearly conjured by magic. And without spoiling it, it would make a lot of sense to just keep them very simple shapes. And of course, it helps quite a bit when it comes to the drawing, making it easier for myself to draw the creature over many panels. I guess this goes to the point that it's important that whenever you're doing anything sequential, that you don't create a design that will be very hard to translate over many panels or frames. Try not to hurt yourself making really complex designs. You'll save quite a bit of headache. If you think your design is a pain to draw over many instances, then chances are it probably is. So there is justification for being lazy here. At least that's how I convince myself. I'm the first to admit that I am not great at action scenes. My primary profession up to this point was doing illustrations for covers and just anything static. So you'll notice the final panel is just a slash, and that's a very deliberate decision because I wasn't too sure how I would tackle it otherwise. It really took me a while to think about how I would tackle the expressions here. You'll notice that on panel 4, her head goes from a straight on frontal view to looking around her shoulder. While I would have loved to just paint a frontal view because I am solid at doing portraiture and I just want to have any excuse to be lazy, it didn't really make much sense in this context, so much so that I had to redo that panel. The other thing to note is I had to find a lot of references on how to draw dogs and wolves, and figuring out a good way to simplify them for wolf's expressions. If you've read the rest of the volume, you'll realize that I ended up being very conservative when it comes to when I have wolf express anything or emote, because it's simply not going to look right in a lot of cases. I was worried about how people might think about that, but then I realized that a lot of studios, even Studio Ghibli, when it comes to Princess Mononoke, a lot of the shots with the wolves, they didn't actually move or express them either. And it's not because they're incapable of doing it, it's mostly because it wouldn't look right when you're stylizing wolves like that to have every expression shown. I mean, the excuse is these are talking wolves and magical wolves, so why bother being too realistic with them, right? Whatever looks right, you just sometimes have to take that route instead of the realistic route. You'll see me initially painting the first panel rather than leaving it as the black and white in the final. This was a deliberate decision because I felt like it didn't really have the impact that I wanted. It was a gut feeling, and a lot of times you have to trust it, even when you have to erase something that you've basically completed. This is sort of a lesson to never really get too attached to what you do, which is a mistake that a lot of beginners make. They sort of have a sunk cost fallacy when it comes to their work. And even for myself, I have to remind myself that for the sake of quality, I have to be willing to take whatever measures possible. And if something doesn't look right deep into the painting, I'll be willing to erase it and start over. Ultimately, if I didn't show you this video, then you probably wouldn't have known anyways. What matters is the final product. So whatever it takes to reach that point is entirely to your discretion. Well, this was a very fun page to do because I've done a lot of book covers, and this was designed like it was a book cover. A straight up frontal view shot of the monster creeping behind her. This was also a very good excuse to start adding more details than normal because it's such a very interesting shot. A pattern you'll notice is that a lot of my panels are not always going to be rendered or have this much detail, and that's by design. Firstly, if I were to render and add details to every single panel, it's gonna take forever to finish this graphic novel. And second, a lot of shots are simply not good enough compositions for me to put so much priority on it. It's what I like to call throwaway shots. There's just a lot of them when it comes to one person moves from one place to another or that sort of thing. Those shots are not really interesting in a lot of cases. You can make it as interesting as possible, but there's only a certain limit to it, and I wouldn't want to put too much attention on those, whereas the ones where it's a full page, nice layout, I would find out midway that I should probably put more attention to this because it's such a nice shot. It's like if you've ever looked back into the cartoon SpongeBob SquarePants, there are some still frames where if they want to show something really disgusting, emphasizing it, then they have just one really rendered image of that thing. If it works for SpongeBob, then I am more than willing to take that into my own work. This was the first page where we start to see the alternative world, where Lila and Wolf are talking privately in their minds. Despite what I'm showing you here, there was a lot of experimentation on the side to figure out if there is an appealing way of creating those scenes. And out of many attempts, like introducing several values or introducing certain colors, the one that stood out the best was simply to have pure black and white. And it was also the most time efficient one. It did its job because it contrasts with all the colors that are happening in the real life quote unquote panels. And you'll also notice that the edges are very sharp in the sequences, which is a contrast to my normal style where it's very chaotic and sometimes very soft. And that contrast, that visual contrast, is very important to create that distinction for storytelling. When it comes to this sort of thing, you don't want to just tell them that this is an alternative world. You want to have visual cues to show that there are major differences. And that's a tool that you'll notice in most of every professional work that you see. Even if it's very subconscious for the viewers, there will be a lot of visual clues that sort of tells them that something is off. And this is where you can really play around with visual elements to create this sort of dynamic. Continuing with this magical realm, I want to mention that it's actually not as easy as it looks. As you would imagine, stripping down all the elements into black and white and making it appealing can be quite tough. When it comes to painting with the full spectrum of colors, you get to use stuff like midtones and just colors in the middle that lets you distinguish certain elements. But in this case, I can't use blue to denote Lila's shirt. So I have to simplify it to either white or black. And ultimately, I chose black for visual reasons. In addition, you might have noticed that Wolf talks in a pinkish color bubble. That was a very deliberate decision because he would have to be able to stand out within this magical realm while also translating outside of it when he talks in the real world. So there, it might look very simple here, but there are definitely a lot of moving parts that I want to future proof. Because basically every chapter they will go into this realm to some extent. So it was very important for me to get this right now so that every other chapter can reference off of this. I guess this is a good page to mention that every composition you see is designed deliberately with text in mind, which should be very obvious, but a lot of people do make the mistake when they're starting out on creating the artwork first and focusing too much on it and not considering the other elements of it. In comics and graphic novels, that would be speech bubbles. Those have visual weight, so you have to consider those when you are creating your compositions. It's no different than the figure that you're drawing, or the wolf, or the car, it doesn't matter, whatever visual element is. When you put in those speech bubbles, they are now part of the artwork. One thing I urge you to check out are the processes of book cover designers, because obviously they have to consider where the title is. And generally speaking, the clients would be giving them the title, and even possibly where the titles and the author names and such must go on the cover. And it is up to the illustrator to create artwork all adhering to those textual elements. So for me, this was really nothing new, but for others, again, ignoring a huge part of your composition in the text is often a big mistake, and it can often create very imbalanced and lopsided compositions when you just shoehorn the text afterward. The four panels where she is trying to think is some of my favorite panels that I've done for Volume 1. If you've ever wanted to test your character design and how feasible it is, then you should want to do these sort of rotations just to make sure that your character looks appealing from these angles. These four panels were a good test for Lila. It's generally pretty easy to take any character design and find one good angle for them, whereas it's harder when you're dealing with four different ones. And to keep them somewhat consistent with one another is another test, something that animators are probably very familiar with, anyways. But it is something to think about whenever you are dealing with characters. Now, that's not to say that every character needs to be perfectly modeled for the rotation. A lot of artistic liberties are taken, especially when some of the angles don't look right. But you do want to make sure that it's believable from all angles and that it's appealing enough that you can get the character to do a lot of poses and a lot of facial expressions and a lot of rotations. Given that Lila is the main character of the story, I had to make sure she would look right from all angles. Whereas a character that just needs to appear for maybe one panel, you can get away with a lot more, making sure that it looks right for that one panel, and that's all there is to it. Normally, artists are conditioned to work with a white canvas and putting dark lines of it. Whereas in this case, I reversed it, which made things a little bit weird. Now, that's not to say that it's exceedingly difficult to do this, but it felt like working with my opposite hand, where it just feels weird, you know. But it's also a very good test, sort of, to reset your mind and see if you can conceptualize things in a different visual context. It feels like I'm making a big deal of this, but it's not as easy as you think, even when you're switching that little thing in your work. It presents new challenges, even if the challenges aren't that much different. As an anecdote, one of my high school projects was to work on these scratch boards where you start with a black scratch board and you use a pin, you can scratch out and create white lines on it. And I remember back then as a younger artist that it was a very difficult task. And while it did get easier over the years, again, it presents new problems, and you sort of have to shift your mind into it. Whenever you see a character centered like this, the name that artists like to give this sort of composition is called the iconic shot. As you imagine, it looks pretty epic, especially with her coming out of the fog. You'll probably see this sort of shot for a lot of your favorite anime and cartoons in action sequences. Like the bottom three panels here is a direct ripoff of Dragon Ball Z. You know when a character gets blasted with these energy balls and then it didn't actually phase them. There's a lot of smoke around, and when it dissipates, it turns into the iconic shots. You'll find that despite I am drawing a graphic novel, that I borrow quite a bit from cinematography. A lot of concepts from different industries can overlap, which is why I tell people to always study different media, precisely because you don't know where you can draw inspiration from. Sometimes something will work regardless of what medium it is. All of it comes down to visual problem solving, so it doesn't really matter where you're taking it from. I debated with myself quite heavily on how I would have Lila dispatch her foe here. Then I realized I introduced the graffiti spray can earlier in the chapter, so it felt appropriate to bring it back for the combat sequence. It also felt appropriate that she is conjuring these dragons or wolf like things at the shadow monster because she had just been speaking with Wolf. Even though it's subtle, it was deliberate because I wanted to show that Lila isn't exactly the most creative person ever. She tends to live in the moment, and she probably didn't really have much time to think about how she was going to save her own life. As for the colors, despite the earlier pages showing the graffiti paint being more of the purplish pinkish side, I opted to just use very strong red because it looked way better despite not being logical. If it's magic anyways, then why would I need to worry what it is in reality? I might as well just go with whatever looks the best for these panels. Take advantage of your artistic liberties where you can. I initially had this page be a lot more violent, and a big part of the art direction is contemplating just what type of audience I want to attract here. My initial plan for the graphic novel was to be a lot edgier, but I ultimately chose not to simply because it would put this graphic novel inaccessible to my younger audiences. Yes, I completely understand that kids nowadays could access whatever content they really want on the internet, but at the same time, I also don't want to have to explain to people why my monsters were being defeated in a very violent manner. And honestly, I'm not even that much of a fan to draw that sort of thing, nor am I very good at it. So, like with Lila's powers, I wanted to let the readers have their own imagination on how the monster perishes. Sometimes the best elements of storytelling are left omitted rather than included. One thing to note is how often Wolf's size changes throughout the story. There is a particular reason for that, and I wanted to make an excuse to make it justifiable. Given that Wolf is going to be in a lot of these panels over the story, I didn't want to have him be static in size. It would make compositions much harder to figure out. And in general, even though I would eventually be able to figure them out, it might not be the most optimal, appealing way of executing a composition. And of course, I justify it by simply saying that Wolf is possessing Lila's body, so he's technically not in the material world. It's however she imagines him. In this particular composition for the final pages of Chapter 1, it just felt far more epic if Wolf was massive here, for the sake of the composition, technically, and also for storytelling purposes. It's like having a dragon behind her. And like I said in previous explanations, changing the scale of your elements in the piece is almost always better than to have the same sizes over and over again. If you're wondering as well, professional productions change the sizes of characters all the time to fit a composition. Maybe it's not as obvious as this, but you'll notice that certain characters in your favorite anime and cartoons may grow or shrink an inch here and there whenever the animators see fit. A lot of times, these creative changes are to evoke certain emotions which might be necessary for the story. If we're going to be drawing these characters anyways, we might as well take advantage of the fact that we can manipulate them however we want. Whereas if you're dealing with live action actors, not so much.